Thank you so much. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. So we're going to start the next roundtable, which is a roundtable on the breakdown of democratic regimes. And I want to first explain the reason or the choice for the title. As has been mentioned before, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes is the title of a book published by Juan Linz in 1978, if I'm not mistaken. It's a multi-volume book. And it was very influential at the time. It was one of the a very influential comparative analysis of democratic collapse, and it had some interesting contributions regarding the relative weight or the impact of individual agency relative to structural factors in the health and in the survival of democracies, and how democracies can collapse, but in a gradual way rather than suddenly. And I think it's fair to say that it's a book that has had an influence for decades, and probably a book that has been very widely read more recently, How Democracies Die, like feeds off of that book, and the Linz's book influenced the book by Ziblatt and Levitsky. So, without further ado, let me introduce the people who are here and who are going to talk about this and know a lot about this theme. We have here Susan Stokes. She's a professor at the University of Chicago. She's also the president of the American Political Science Association, and she's gonna have a chance to talk about her work on this area, particularly the book that she's published recently. We have as well Pablo Beramendi. He's a professor at the University of Duke. We also have Milan Svolik. He's a professor at the University of Yale. And we have Meng, associate professor at the University of Virginia. So before we get into different themes that touch upon the question of democratic breakdown, democratic backsliding, etc., I want to give you all a chance to say briefly, please, what your latest work is on, right? So in a way, you're saving me the duty to say to everyone why you're here, right? So each of you have made recent contributions on this area, and if you want to say what you're working on recently, and so that people can, in a way, frame what you're going to say during the discussion, and you can start like from right to left.
Great, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. I'm really thrilled. I'm going to speak in English, and I have to start with an anecdote. My dad was a political scientist, and he had a really good friend who was a statistician who was from Norway, who invited my father to come speak in Oslo. And my father asked his friend to translate the first 2 pages of his presentation into Norwegian. And so my father went to the talk, gave the talk. It was a room full of Norwegian statisticians, nerdy people, but really great English skills. And he started his talk in Norwegian. And he said that after the first 2 pages, complete pidgin Norwegian, I'm sure almost unintelligible. And after the first 2 pages, when he switched to English, there was a sigh of relief that broke over the audience. So I'm sparing you. My Spanish is better than my dad's Norwegian for sure, but I'm sparing you my Spanish. I actually wanted to start. I published a book in last fall called The Backsliders, which is an attempt to actually understand why we are experiencing a wave of democratic backsliding, which we kind of see as having count basically sort of 27 cases in 22 countries since 1998, when Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela for the first time. And my book is an attempt to explain why we're seeing that this wave, what it is that, why it's happening and why it's happening now. And one of the kind of key answers to that question has to do with income inequality and the impact of income inequality on the probability of democratic backsliding, which turns out to be a structural factor that's very important. So I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. But I wanted to actually reflect for a moment on Juan Linz. I was appointed a professor at Yale in 2005. So when he's described as a great scholar of the 20th century, I have to say my entire experience of him was personal experience was in the 21st century. Of course, as a graduate student of Latin American politics and democracy and comparative politics, in the 1980s, we read his work and internalized it and learned an enormous amount from it. But in terms of knowing him personally, meeting him, that started for me in the 21st century. So he was a mature gentleman at that point. He looked nothing like this handsome young man here, but he was. Everything that people said in the earlier panels just so resonated with me, even though I knew him much less time and much less well than they did. He was, elderly and not particularly, sprightly at the time that I knew him, but he was incredibly sharp mentally, and he would come to the comparative politics workshop sometimes. And he would, it was clear from his interventions he was incisive, he was sharp, he had read everything, and he remembered everything. And I soon learned that he had written on almost everything. So after his workshop presence, he would, infallibly send me an email. I guess that was a pretty modern communication technique, and he probably had help doing that, but he would send an email that would cite a bunch of stuff that, of course, I didn't know that I should read on any given topic. And then he would also send along his own papers on this topic, which inevitably were really great, and some of them quite quantitative, as somebody pointed out in the last panel. But I think what really came through in my experience of Juan was his generosity, which many people have already commented on. He was an incredibly generous human being and generous scholar, and obviously a generous mentor. And it's just lovely to have the Institute renamed in his memory. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Annie Meng. Thanks for having me. It's so nice to be here. I did get 12 hours of sleep last night, so I'm not jet lagged from coming from Virginia. I took 3 years of high school Spanish, but I'm realizing that I did not retain it at all. So I will also keep talking in English. A little bit about my work. So most of my work is on authoritarian regimes, but I think part of the reason why I was invited here was some of my newer work is on measuring backsliding. I have an article with Andrew Little called Measuring Democratic Backsliding, and how to measure things correctly is a really big theme in my work, because we can't understand why backsliding is happening, how often it's happening, without having really accurate measures of it. So this is something that I think a lot about. Another kind of big theme of my work, and I think part of, the nice thing about actually starting out more as an autocracy scholar is I often think not just about backsliding or democratic failure, but I think it's equally important to think about these things with respect also to democratization, also with respect to the autocracies that became democracies, the strength of the democracies that kind of came after that, and as a result, whether those democracies hold or whether they backslide or fail. I am currently working on a new book project that kind of combines both of these interests, where there's a heavy emphasis on measurement. So we are collecting new global data on measuring both instances of democratization, but also instances of democratic failure based on observable events that can be kind of easily verified. If I was told I was allowed 1 or 2 slides, so maybe we'll see a cool graph. The other kind of big theme that comes out of this book project is how the kind of nature of autocracy has changed over time, which also affects rates and types of democratization, which then also affects instances and trends with backsliding and democratic failure. A lot of my work kind of steps back and thinks about the big picture.
Hi, I'm Milan Svolik. I'm a professor at Yale. Most of my work is on authoritarianism and most recently democratic backsliding. Just like Sue, Ann, and Pablo, I'm interested in this process and what's happening. Most recently, I'm working on a book that tries to basically ask and answer the question of what everything are people willing to trade a democracy for. And I would like to map it out both in terms of various competing political priorities, economic, social, ethnic, and so on, and both covering the parts of the world where those issues are most salient.
Hi, I'm Pablo Beramendi, and I guess I'm here because of a recent paper I wrote with Carles Bosch and Daniel Stegmuller, revisiting the relationship between income inequality, actually inequality writ large, both wealth and income, and three things: polarization, which I think gets very similar results to what Sue shows, is a huge structural driver of polarization; backsliding, which we proxy about the likelihood of losers' consent; and then the classical definition of the death of democracy, the collapse of the definition of democracy, sort of in a minimalist term, and the moderating role that the level of economic development of the country has in those relationships, right? So that's the most immediate thing. But then, that paper sort of left us all dissatisfied because it has sort of a flavor that economic development or wealth or high GDP per capita is, a barrier against the full collapse of democracy. But none of us can sleep at night for quite a bit of time. And so there are two other things about from my work that tries to help understand why is it that we see this puzzle today of a combination of prosperity and anxiety in democracies like the one in which I live and work, or we live and work, all of us, right? And there are two other aspects of my work that sort of speak to that. One is this focus on the notion of political equality or inequality, and who gets to be represented, who has voice, who is left without voice, and what that implies for their micro-level behavior in terms of participants of a modern democracy, even in countries with high GDP per capita. And the second one, which is more directly related to my older work, is the relationship between economic agglomeration, both in positive terms and in negative terms, spatial concentration of frustration, and the interaction between that and political institutions, and how that sort of poses a threat in terms of the way sort of democracies are able to deliver or not, and to process demands or not, and link this sort of inequality to various political outcomes. And thank you for having me here. It's an honor to be back again to the institution that I joined 30 years ago this September. So 1996.
So let's start the roundtable in the sense of having like an open discussion. So I've prepared and I've circulated a few questions, a few topics that I think it would be useful to touch upon and discuss. And if others come up, of course we can, I think we can also play by ear. But one of the first one that I thought about, and I think it's useful to kind of like frame and set the entire discussion, is the definition of backsliding, right? Like both theoretically and empirically, right? How can we tell backsliding when we see it? So to what extent can we diagnose the existence of backsliding? And another related question that I think is very relevant is, when does backsliding become breakdown, right? So how can we say that a democracy is in bad health, and when can we say that the democracy is no longer, right? And so this is open to all of you, so you can jump in.
It's a measurement question. So.
Oh man, I'm setting things up? Okay. This question is really complicated because democracy is a contested term. And so as a result, what counts as backsliding and breakdown is also necessarily contested depending on how you think democracy is measured, right? So like the kind of different layers of democracy is, I think everyone can agree with the electoral core, right? A democracy is when you have free and fair elections. I think most people can agree on kind of the second layer, which is that, protections of certain rights that really make sure elections stay competitive, things like media freedom, protection of speech and stuff like that, is also fairly core to the definition of democracy. And then you then have kind of getting into broader kind of layers, right? Other kinds of rights protection, rule of law, executive constraints. I think there's a little bit of more disagreement, right, in terms of whether people prefer the more minimalist electoral definition or whether people prefer broader definitions. I think so. I would say like the kind of simple answer as to when backsliding becomes breakdown, it kind of depends on whether you think it's just the electoral component, in which case it becomes breakdown when elections no longer remain competitive. If you are a broad expansionist definitions person, then it could be that you think that democracy has broken down when some of these outer layers, like rule of law, executive constraints, breaks down. So it kind of depends on what your definition is. The one thing that I did want to note, just kind of beyond these definitions, is that, in my opinion, sometimes the discussion around backsliding verges beyond definitions that I think even broad people would consider, right? So I think a lot of times there's a lot of slippage into governance, right? So I think that when we think about defining democracy, I think most of us can agree that governance, or like whether we like a policy or not, is not really part of the definition of democracy. But I think sometimes there's a little bit of a tendency in discussions of backsliding to kind of step beyond even broad definitions and start thinking about governance and other outcomes. So I do think it's really important, kind of regardless of what our preferred definition is, to not think about backsliding in terms of outcome-related concepts.
So when we teach our students about concepts in our discipline, we think of three virtues. One is precision, the other is measurability, the third one, it has to help us falsify something. Now, if I take these three metrics and I think about the idea of backsliding, I get a little quibbish, because it's not very precisely defined, as Annie just pointed out. It raises huge measurement problems, which I think we're going to talk about extensively. And it becomes the central part of arguments, which I personally find pretty hard to falsify in the standard ways that we do falsification in the discipline now, and leads to a style of argumentation that is always sort of exposed in some ways. So you see that backsliding leads to the death of democracy only in those cases in which the death of democracy actually takes place, however you define it. And if it doesn't happen, well, it may still lead to the death of democracy. It just hasn't taken enough time. In some ways, I feel sometimes when I read some things or hear some contributions, it reminds me of the communists in 1989. It's like, this was not real communism. The real communism is yet to come. Well, what are the criteria, under what conditions do we consider this a backsliding democracy or not? And there's a lot of excellent work trying to answer that question. But there is also, as Annie was saying, the conversation is sometimes a bit too loose and too frustrating for my taste. But yeah.
I hear what Annie's saying about sometimes that there's a kind of overlap between parties that espouse policies that seem extreme and that maybe I don't like, or some analyst doesn't like, and democratic backsliding. And I think one of the ways that maybe is a conversation that happens with people who are focused on Europe and the U.S. And I think one of the things that's useful for reminding ourselves that policies that seem anathema, as long as they're not policies that have to do with changing the regime or stopping the rule of law or what have you, to remember that there can be governments that undermine democracy and have policies that maybe we like, is to think about the left-wing version of democratic backsliding. And there are a number of leftist governments, particularly in Latin America and also South Africa and a number of other countries where governments that are political parties that are leftist in the sense that they favor a more generous welfare state and higher levels of taxation, larger role of the state in the economy, and so forth. Maybe also are that they elevate the position, they celebrate ethnic minorities and people of color and so forth. Those governments can also backslide. They can destroy democratic institutions. That's what's happened in Mexico. That's what happened in Mexico under Andrés Manuel López Obrador. and to some extent is continuing under Claudia Sheinbaum. So the elimination of an independent court, tremendous harassment and winking at oppression of journalists, of independent journalists, and so on and so forth. So agreed that we need to disentangle sort of policy positions from democratic backsliding. But I think it's, things are hard to measure. And there are going to be cases that are difficult to decide on, and there are going to be instances where you're not sure what's happening until something later has happened. So I spend a fair amount of time worrying about Turkey, and wondering whether we can think of Turkey as a democracy at all anymore, or if it's a country that is fully authoritarian. It's a country where the ruling party has lost at least local elections and eventually ceded power in local elections. On the other hand, now it's a country in which basically the opposition is in prison, and parts of the opposition have been in prison in earlier elections. So I think I'm giving up. Optimist though I am, I think I'm giving up on Turkey and calling it. But it's sort of like we had this problem with thinking about democracy and dictatorship. We didn't know whether the Liberal Democrats in Japan were a authoritarian party until they would lose an election and either step aside or not step aside. So that's not these problems of identification of particular cases, the fact that there are going to be boundary cases, the fact that there are going to be some cases that are difficult to code in real time. That's sort of the nature of what we do. But I think we can still have some conceptual clarity about what we mean by democratic backsliding. And we may not mean the same thing, but at least we should be clear when we write about it what we mean. So I've actually just completed a paper with Metlis Lebens, who is a professor at the Central European University, about where we really go back to Nancy Bermeo's classic 2016 article and adopt some of the language that she uses, modify some of the language given that conventions have changed since she published it, to define democratic backsliding as a form of degradation of democracy in which the key actors are elected civilian officials as opposed to the degradation of democracy when it's undertaken by military officials, and generally takes the form of extreme executive aggrandizement, so that executives are undermining both horizontal and vertical accountability. So horizontal accountability in the sense of being able to be held to account or constrained or monitored in some way by horizontal institutions like courts and legislatures, and vertical accountability, meaning the ability for people to vote in free and fair elections and be well informed, and cast their ballots freely, and have governments step down peaceably. That peaceably part is complicated for Americans at the moment. So, So I advocate for not giving up on something that seems to be so blatantly happening all around us because we are worried about coding particular cases, if we can have conceptual clarity and can figure out, cases one by one. The other part of the paper that Melis and I just finished is a comparison of different methods of identifying cases of democratic backsliding that different scholars have used, which are somewhat different. All of them, have justifications, involve trade-offs, and produce somewhat different lists of countries that have engaged in backsliding.
Maybe to continue on this theme, so why is this such a big measurement problem? And I think one of the reasons is that backsliding today, when we talk about backsliding, it's actually not what Linz was writing about. It's not the breakdown of democracy where a military takes over, arrests the opposition, fills prisons with political opponents and journalists. And that's a good thing. And one of the key characteristics, it seems to me, is that therefore it happens more gradually, and therefore it often happens within the context of existing democratic institutions. So if there's one thing that I think would differentiate backsliding from the older forms of breakdown, is that brute force plays a very limited role. Most changes are institutional. And so what else is there? So first of all, how does this present a measurement problem? Well, it presents a measurement problem because, to use a term that Andreas Schedler has used, the menu of manipulation is rich. Right, so there are so many ways to rig institutions, and it's really, measurement-wise, it's really hard to figure out, well, so how do we systematically code or count or measure into a simple metric or a single metric the manipulation of the media, changes to the electoral system, attacks on the opposition, the many ways in which politicians with authoritarian ambitions try to make it easier for them to stay in power. But in spite of that, I think another common feature, other than the absence of force and its use, is that, and the studios mentioned it, is that when contemporary backsliding happens, it's almost definitionally starts with incumbents undermining power rather than other actors. So if I could show a slide, about 6-7 years ago, I decided to try to sidestep the problem of measurement by taking the narratives that the Freedom House, the organization that provides one of these ratings of democracy, compiles around the cases when they... It's over here. So when they... The first one, when they downgrade a country from free to partly free or not free. And I took their narratives, which are usually several pages, and simply tried to differentiate, so how often is it that in these cases, so starting in the 1970s, that we have some outside actor, let's say the military, subverting democracy, or we have a democratically elected actor, the ruling party, the president, undermining democracy. And that graph is showing you the fraction of those attempts when it is, in fact, the executive that's doing it. So I call these executive takeovers. And you can clearly see that this is increasing. One thing that was surprising to me when I put this figure together was that already in the 1970s, actually about half of the cases when democracy declined enough, according to Freedom House, to no longer call it free, already half of those were executive takeovers. But this has really increased in the 90s. And roughly beginning with the 2000s, we have 9 out of 10 cases when a democracy is no longer called free, it is because somebody from within that country is, somebody that's democratically elected is responsible for that. So maybe that would be the other feature, other than the absence of force, is that this really happens because a democratically elected executive is undermining democracy. Maybe the other feature that I think is a little trickier is that in order to undermine democracy, an elected politician cannot do that without not only controlling the executive, but also usually some other branch of the government, usually the legislature and so on, to pass changes like changing the electoral system, to restructure courts, reduce civil liberties. One usually needs a cooperation of the legislature, and that means that the same political force is typically controlling the executive and the legislature. And the only time you can do that is if you are really popular, if you get elected. And so this to me implies two things about backsliding. One is that definitionally, backsliding does not happen when politicians attempt to undermine democracy. It happens when politicians want to undermine democracy, and voters let them get away with it, right? So in other words, the voter plays a key role in this process. And she plays a key role, partly, I think, because these backsliders represent, right? They get elected and very often re-elected many times. Think Orban, 4 times in Hungary. Erdogan, several times. Trump, twice now, right? So in other words, they have at least partially a democratic mandate. They are appealing to the voter on the basis of something that really gets them elected, and crucially, not only, let's say, within the executive branch, but across the branches of the government. So that popularity is genuine. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just to follow up on this, which I very much agree with. And since we are talking about Juan Linz and the Juan Linz Institute, in his classic book, I mean, without using the term, he's talking about backsliding because the threat is about the armed takeover by the military, but in a context in which there's high degree of extremism, mostly in multi-party democracies, in which something what he defines as legal revolutions takes place. What is a legal revolution in his term is the attempts by executives to undermine checks and balances, control courts, change the way parliaments are elected, etc. These are exactly the sort of symptoms that we now sort of equate with backsliding that he saw in many instances as coming from the extreme left. So his diagnostics of the 1930s is the left is just going too crazy on an agenda that is all about legal revolutions as an instrumental step to take over everything, including the organization of the market, and that sort of paves the way or creates incentives or the need for an overreaction that leads to sort of an autocratic thing. The nature of the threat today is extremely different. There is no army saving the economic elites from the Communist Party in the United States. The extremism today is much more asymmetric. I mean, all the studies I've read about polarization in the United States defines it as very asymmetric, but the symptoms about the behavior of the executive, the idea of trying to tamper with courts, with legislation, with electoral procedures, with undermining checks and balances, with, populating the Supreme Court with friendly judges, etc. They were all there as part of the strategies of these semi-loyal, disloyal, anti-loyal sort of political parties. And the question is, my worry about some of the conversations that we're having around backsliding is that we draw too quick an analogy between those behaviors that we see sort of reproducing things that led to horrible outcomes in the 1930s as leading to sort of similarly bad outcomes in contexts that have changed quite dramatically. Right? We're operating in a different international context, in a different economic context, in a different institutional context. And this is our challenge, and I haven't figured this out. Our challenge is to think about how does this interaction between these symptoms that look very much alike in interaction with a context that is fundamentally different is leading to what outcomes. That's what we haven't really.
It's interesting, Pablo, because I thought you were going to somewhere else with the end of your comments. So I heard you say that Juan Linz was identifying instances of what we might now call democratic backsliding as a backdrop to military intervention, and
as the origin of a degree of the other thing that he identifies is this leads to extreme levels of instability, violence, civil disorder to a level that is unseen, ever seen.
So civil war and maybe then breakdown.
Proximity
Correct.
to that, and that leads to an intervention. Right?
Well, so where I thought you were going, and I agree with this, is that we may be so. I just said in my previous intervention that the key defining feature of democratic backsliding as a form of degradation of democracy, as opposed to military coups, is that the actors are civilian elected actors. I mean, it's pretty much what Milan was saying as well. But what we are seeing instances in which backsliding leaders cultivate the military to help keep them in power, and so this is a drama that has not ended. And we're putting names on things, but they're changing as we watch them. In the United States, in Brazil, in Mexico, leaders who wanted to either stay in power or have outcomes that were, because López Obrador obeyed the sexenio, he obeyed term limits, he didn't violate them, but he had other things that he wanted to do, and has cultivated the military in a way that it was kept separate from politics in Mexico all through the PRI period. And you had Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro openly, trying to get the military to intervene to keep them in power after they lost elections. That story is not over in the United States, by the way. We've seen in the second Trump administration an enormous purging of loyalist, constitutionalist military people and the imposition of constitutionalists and the imposition of loyalists, presumably, possibly in the lead up to some kind of putschist effort. We still hope that won't happen. We hope they won't try. We hope if they try, it won't succeed. But there was a dry run in 2020. So I guess what I'm saying is, so I'm invested in that distinction. I think it's very helpful to think who are the actors, and what are the outcomes. The actors could be military officials, or they could be civilian elected officials, usually executives, and the outcomes can look quite different. But there could also be a convergence around, sort of along the lines of the executive coup, the self coup, or the palace coup.
Could I actually return to something that Milan was talking about, which I think is super interesting. This question of who backslides. Is it strong leaders or is it weak leaders, right? So, because this is a really interesting strategic question, right? On one hand, it makes sense if you're like a strong leader and you can kind of control everything and the backsliding goes really smoothly, so maybe you do it. But on the other hand, it almost makes more sense for weak leaders to backslide, because if you're strong and you can keep electing, you're popular, you can keep being elected, why do you need to bother to personalize institutions, right? So thinking from a strategic perspective, we should actually expect weak leaders to backslide, right? So I coded this and I looked at it because I was so sure that I was going to find that second term politicians tend to do this. So a small caveat, my dependent variable was failure instead of just backsliding. So maybe it could be that if we were looking at what leaders tend to backslide, maybe the answer would be a little bit different. So I was looking at whether first term versus second term leaders, whether the failure happens after the first term or second term. I was so sure it was going to be the re-elected leaders, and I found no difference.
What do you mean by failure?
Sorry?
What's failure?
Yep, so actually, can I show a slide? Can I show my slide? Yep.
It's just that I can't see where the cursor is.
The cursor is
Right there.
Yeah, right there. Awesome, thanks.
This one?
Yes, this one. This is based off of data that we coded for our new book project. So the black line here is, so we basically coded all regime spells from 1946 to the present. And we coded whether the regime was a democracy or an autocracy. We are going with the kind of electoral definition of democracy, so whether leaders are elected using free and fair elections. What I have graphed here is the black line is the annual democratic failure rate. So it's just the percentage of democracies in that year that failed. And then we further break this up by failure via coup and failure via what we call democratic consolidation. So you can think of that as like kind of the institutional breakdown channel. So the red line is failure by coup and the green line is failure by incumbent consolidation. So we code the kind of institutional instances of failure using like pretty observable events. So we have like a whole list. So it's things like banning and jailing opposition, shutting down the legislature, canceling elections, making elections so non-competitive that we think it warrants that switch from democracy to autocracy. Based on kind of a list of actions that incumbents can take. So using that as the dependent variable, I coded whether the failure event happened during the first term or kind of later re-election terms. And I was really surprised actually. I think what's going on, the cases were almost perfectly split. Like half of them happened still in the first term, and then others happened after re-election. So I think what's going on is, I think that the cases that are really salient to us of breakdown were the stronger democracies, because it's more surprising when they break down, right? But there's a lot of really weak democracies that break down all the time, and in fact, this happened a lot during the Cold War. And so I think maybe because those cases are just way less salient to us, and also because failure happens quite quickly within the first couple of years of democratization, I think that we're maybe just not quite thinking of those cases as much. But a couple other kind of interesting trends that come out is, so first is, this graph actually very much goes along with the graph that Milan just showed about the decline of failure via coups, right? So that's the red line here. So coups were just much more prevalent during the Cold War, much less prevalent since the 1990s. So a couple of interesting trends for democratic failure via incumbent consolidation. So one is one thing is the rate of incumbent consolidation is now, there's more democracies that die via consolidation than via coup, right? And so this echoes a lot of the existing literature that talks about how the ways in which democracy dies has now shifted, right? Away from coercion and explicit military takeovers, more towards this institutional channel. But the other thing that's really interesting is the kind of overall rate of democratic failure via incumbent consolidation is lower now compared to the Cold War, right? So the green line was way higher actually during the Cold War. And I think a lot of those cases, again, are more of the weaker democratic cases that we kind of just don't think about a ton. And so a lot of those cases actually happened in post-independence cases. So for instance, a lot of African cases where, upon decolonization, there was kind of, initially a democracy, but parties centralized power and basically turn it into an autocracy pretty quickly. That's why you have this kind of spike in the 60s. Other instances are just kind of, weak democracies, a lot in South America and Latin America, where we kind of see this ping-ponging back and forth between coup, democracy, incumbent consolidation, coup, and just like we see a lot of these very short spells, which also explains kind of the trends in the during the Cold War.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
So the U.S. doesn't appear here then? The U.S. is consolidated throughout?
The U.S. just we don't ever code it as having flipped to an autocracy. So it's in here in the sense where it's like contributing to the denominator.
So this is, I mean, I think that this is fine, but I think it's too coarse-grained to allow us to study what's happening in the United States today, or what's happening in a number of countries where democracy is still there in the sense that the ruling party can lose elections, but the rule of law is under serious threat. The press is threatened. In international affairs, the United States is acting much more like an autocracy. I buy what you're doing, but I think that if we insist on that there's no there in places that look like there's something really weird happening and really unusual and important. We're just missing we're missing a big important story that we need to be explaining as social scientists.
So I think that it's not that there's no there. I think that I agree with you in that we need to be very precise about concepts, right? So this graph is about democratic failure. I think that that's a different concept than democratic backsliding. And the other thing that I wanted to say was I actually completely agree with you that we shouldn't give up on coding these things, right? I think that kind of an unfortunate trend that I've seen with data collection is that individual researchers have kind of like ceded data collection to these like big organizations, which, I think, okay, I'll just say it. So things like Freedom House or VDEM, right? Where in part because it's panel data and the questions were written so long ago, they can't change it now, right? We're not innovating and we're not improving on what these measures could be. But I'm also just seeing like so much pressure with grad students to publish quickly now. And so I understand the incentives behind like not collecting your own data. But if each person just like even picked like one variable that they liked, like trying to measure, media freedom well, I think we can do it and we should do it, and we shouldn't be kind of ceding data collection so much to these big organizations.
Yeah, so the next thing I wanted for us to discuss is the question of trends, right? So this graph is on trends of democratic breakdown, right? And so I wanted to, hear your takes and your insights on, given the difficulties that you all have discussed, right? The questions of different definitions of democracy, the existence of boundary cases, the fact that backsliding is a multidimensional phenomenon, and so it's hard to then turn it into a single dimension and figure out where we are exactly. So that trend is on democratic failure, democratic breakdown. So what can we say about trends of democratic backsliding, right? So situations where we are not there yet, but we might be closer than before. I don't know what.
Do you want to go first? No. So just picking up on what Sue and Annie were discussing about there, and so the nice thing about the minimalist definition of democracy, the breakdown, the failure, etc., is that it's very clear and it's very precise. The cost is that we summarize everything to a sort of a binary outcome, and we lose a lot of the analysis of the symptoms things, right? So in the paper I refer to, and I'm not going to ask you to show the slides because I can convey them with words. We use the ultimate outcome is this measure, and yes, development helps protect democracy even in context of very high inequality, very high polarization, and even in instances in there is losers' consent. This is the U.S. in whenever 2020 Trump lost and he didn't consent, but then eventually everything sort of worked back to quote unquote normal. But then the question is, so what is happening on the ground that makes us concerned about the state of politics in the United States and is not being picked up by this sort of analysis. And I think one aspect that we haven't paid sufficient attention to is the actual composition of what inequality means. The traditional measures of inequality we use are some combination of land and income inequality over many years, etc. But the composition of inequality is changing in most radical ways, especially at the top in the US. And one of the biggest worries I have is this emergence of these AI tycoons who are extremely dependent on regulatory decisions by the federal government and extremely dependent on the Department of Defense budget, and they're extremely dependent on the state. So paradoxically, we are seeing at the highest level of technological advancement a return to the incentives of the landowners. And the incentives of the landowners was to try to influence the state directly, either through pseudo-democratic means or to capture democracy if they had to, if they saw their interest at risk. That's one thing. The other thing that I think this analysis, which I still stand for, I still think that the ultimate outcome is whether we have elections where the incumbent can lose or not. But we shouldn't lose perspective on the other thing. The other thing is that the system of representation, which is central for understanding how these checks and balances work or not, is basically extremely spatially segregated. And because of the combination of that and presidentialism and the primary system, we had this trifecta of interactions of sort of sorting across a space of people clustered in a space in the coast and in the middle, etc. We all know how it is clustered, interacting with institutions that are extremely malapportioned and giving disproportionate amount of power to people who are extremely loyal to the disloyals, right? And that creates this, the combination of these things is very idiosyncratic to the United States, but is not going to be captured by these things. This is all in the sort of bad news part of the trends of what I see in the United States. What is a silver lining? The silver lining is, well, we have an instance, 2020, in which there was an attempt that failed to basically subvert democracy. It lasted about a week or something. Fine. And now we have, Sue was referring to this, these people are not stupid, they learn. They have been working towards correcting some of the levers that prevented that attempt from working at the state level, at the courts, at the legislature, etc. The one thing that we haven't discussed enough, pay attention enough to, is how the internal heterogeneity within party families, even within the MAGA movement itself, may be a factor of importance here. The key thing for all these takeovers to work, we know from all our work, is there has to be effective coordination between different types of elites that have incentives to allow democracy to collapse or take over the regime directly. I want to open the conversation among the group because I'm actually very interested about what you have to say about how internally coherent are these people in their preferences on international politics, on domestic politics, on corruption, on the release of the Epstein files, on all sorts of things, to see whether the MAGA coalition is going to be coherent enough and effective enough in posing a real threat, or is just an unraveling mess that is just a constant source of headaches and that doesn't really pose much of a threat to the survival of the regime, because those are the two interpretations that are sort of now on the table in thinking of trends.
Do you want?
I mean, I can say a few things on this. Maybe to start as a point of disagreement on the role of GDP. Like if I were to list another distinctive feature of what's happening now as opposed to during the times that Linz was writing about, would be that democracy seems to be deteriorating in the democratic erosion way in places where, according to our established wisdom in the discipline, it shouldn't be happening, right? It shouldn't be happening in the United States because it's wealthy and it's a long-lived democracy. It shouldn't have been happening in Hungary or Poland because these were the exemplars of how things should go right after a transition to democracy. And so, but maybe the distinguishing feature here is that maybe GDP per capita is protective, or whatever comes with it, the modernization hypothesis, is protective against the Linz-type democratic breakdowns, but maybe the erosion that we are talking about, and maybe not, maybe we're mixing the two, but the erosion part, maybe that one is actually a feature of politics that the GDP per capita or anything else doesn't really provide much of immunity to. And maybe one of the reasons is, again, because here, to return to a point that Annie made, which is, so why would you undermine democracy if you are popular, right? Like, and one way I think about it is that you do it because you understand that electoral popularity could be fleeting. And so you know that if you control the legislature today and the executive today, it is unlikely to happen that same way anytime soon. And we could probably give some statistics on that. How often does it actually happen that a single political force controls multiple branches of government? And so for a good politician, and I want to emphasize, for a good politician, not necessarily a bad politician, for a good politician, that's something you don't waste. And one way you don't waste it is you rewrite the rules so that the next time it's slightly easier to maintain power in spite of declining popularity. So it's an insurance. And so this would be my logic for why even strong politicians, or even popular, and precisely because they are popular, they're able to achieve this, and why maybe it is also therefore inherently a part of democratic politics, because the continuum here is between something that's perfectly democratic, slight change to electoral rules or something like that, all the way to recalibrating democracy that undermines civil liberties or excludes opposition candidates from running.
I actually, just to jump on that last point really fast, I think that's actually a really important part, that I think deepening democracy and democratization probably spurs backsliding tendencies, right? Because, and I think it's also totally possible for both forces to exist at the same time. I feel like we almost don't think about that as much, right? Yeah, I mean, democracy creates winners and losers, right? And so either when you're a loser or when you fear being that loser, then there's that incentive to backslide. So yeah, I totally agree with that.
Wait.
Could I just say
Yeah.
one, because Pablo, so is MAGA a coherent force? and I think that's a really important question, because I think it's an incredibly coherent force right now because of the word Trump. Right? I mean, so there's no such thing as MAGA. There's
Right.
only one person called Donald Trump
Okay.
who is able to, through primary out any opponents, through his own personal popularity. And I think that question is really important for when there's no more Trump. All right? Like, so as long as Trump is
Exactly.
here, I think MAGA is Trump, and it has to cohere, because whoever dares to be a detractor
But
is
no.
going to be dismissed.
True.
Right,
That is
right.
a mechanism that is very well understood and is
Yeah.
very concerning.
Yeah.
I mean, leaving aside the fact that Trump is no spring chicken, and
Yeah.
that the people who will follow him
Yeah.
are far less capable of keeping the coherence of the movement going. From the perspective of the long-run threat that this movement, I'm not thinking, I mean, Trump is a problem for sure. But even with Trump, there's significant internal disagreements over, even corruption. Like, some survey evidence suggests that there are many MAGA voters who are thinking that the levels of corruption are untenable despite the informational environment, which we haven't talked about, the relationship between information and backsliding. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I genuinely do not know how coherent the potential alliances between those people who would be semi-loyal, disloyal, instrumentally, and I don't even know how much preference falsification, to use a very old term, there is within the GOP party and the people who detest the Democrats in a hyper-polarized context, but are basically hiding their true colors, waiting or sitting out this sort of hegemony of a person like Trump within the party. And if there's a lot of preference falsification within the GOP, then the threat is a lot weaker than if there is not. And so that's where the ambiguity sort of exists. I do want to say something about GDP, but I'll wait for later.
I just wanted to say that Milan is exactly right when he says, that these leaders are popular and they have a lot of popular support, and sometimes we used to talk about them as stealthy. They don't seem so stealthy now. If they were elected and then did things that people weren't expecting and were upset about, you would expect to see a collapse in their support at the second election, and we don't generally see that. There's a dip in Hungary, but then it revives, and so it's really true. He's pointing to a very important fact and puzzle, why is there so much support for backsliding leaders? But the other thing I wanted to add to that is there are all kinds of contradictions in the kind of logic of rule of these folks. They surround themselves with very loyal people because they have to, because they are breaking things. They're breaking laws, they're breaking constitutional norms, they're breaking norms. So they need people who are willing to carry out, to go along with that program. And that means, it tends to mean people who are more loyal than they are competent. For one thing, you want to have people who don't have a lot of exit options in terms of their job, their future job. So think Pete Hegseth. Does he go back to being a weekend anchor on Fox News when he's done being the Secretary of Defense or Secretary of War in the United States? So this is a person who is, so it isn't just a kind of quirky feature of Donald Trump that he likes to surround himself, and that he's an egomaniac, which is obviously true, that he surrounds himself with yes men and yes women. It's a kind of structural necessity. Now, there are other leaders of this kind who have been more skillful and more strategic. I think Orban was quite skillful and strategic. I think Erdogan is as well. But they are caught in a trap of needing to almost cultivating a situation of emperor's new clothes, where the people around them are not able to come to them and say, for example, in the United States, on election day in Canada, nobody in the Trump circle went to the president and said, Mr. President, not a good day to repeat your desire to make Canada the 51st state of the United States on election day in Canada. Thank you. Mark Carney has Donald Trump to thank for his election. So they screw up. I mean, this is the technical political science term. They screw up a lot, and they screw up, and so they often lose popularity. And so even when the rules have been changed, and it's harder to get them out of office, they still lose elections. There are at least 6 by a kind of back of the envelope count that Javier Corrales and I have done recently. Six cases they lost elections. Another 6 or so they have abided by term limits, often after they didn't abide by term limits in earlier elections, but presumably they're abiding by them in part because they don't think they'd win if they did run. Another one who just decided not to run for re-election even though he wasn't under term limits. Then there are a couple who died in office. So they don't last forever. They last too long. On average, by our count, they're in office for about 9 years, and an enormous amount of damage can be done to institutions in 9 years. But I think that the idea that they take aggressive action in part because they anticipate a fleeting character to their popularity, even if it takes a while for that fleeting thing to play out, is a good observation. In addition, they just want to do things that they're not allowed to do by democratic rules of the game. I mean, we really don't have the rule of law in many respects in the United States today. We have roving bands of armed posses that work for the president, who have killed American citizens and shot Americans and legal migrants and undocumented migrants in American cities. And that's something that you're going to need a lot of power and a lot of absence of horizontal accountability to be able to do those things.
So I wanted to go back to a question I think is relevant to a lot of your work, which is, and it's already been mentioned, right? So you were talking before about how elected leaders who are arguably strong in the present, but fearing future loss, are still willing to stretch the rules, to engage in norm breaking, etc. So I wanted to get your take on the role of increasing inequality and the role of increasing inequality that it's concomitant with prosperity and with high GDP per capita in the type of calculus that these leaders that are in government are making.
Okay, so it's time for my slide then. 2 slides.
Let's start with one.
Yes. But I mean, I have already summarized this. So this is a summary picture of coming out of this work with Carles and Daniel, where we sort of reconstruct his next one. The next one. This one. We reconstructed a measure of inequality from the 1900s until essentially today, the historical GDP data, and we using sort of fairly sophisticated duration models, we look at the probability of democratic breakdown, and the standard story holds. The breakdown is very likely to happen when inequality is very high and development is low, and then depending on how you estimate it, you get a sort of a flat surface when there is a lot of inequality but prosperity. But if you account for frailties, that means institutional specificities, then this whole thing, this certainty begins to crumble, and this is where our conversation starts. The next one
So,
is more
just a question. So that shows that inequality increases the likelihood of breakdown both at low and high levels.
No, it's very high. So inequality leads to breakdown at low levels of development, and it may lead in some specific cases to breakdown at
High levels,
of
but
development.
not so much in the middle.
Yeah, no, but no, it goes down. It's sort of in the middle here. It's a- it's
Can
a
I jump in
three-way.
on this? I love your paper, and I found it fascinating. A paper that Eli Rao, a colleague at Tec de Monterrey, and I published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences last year. We look at the impact of various structural factors on the probabilities of democratic erosion. And these are probabilistic models. There's nothing deterministic about it. So we calculate, for example, the probability, given the levels of income inequality in the United States, the probability of democratic erosion in recent, certainly in 2016, was about 9%. So, not super high, a lot higher than you get when you do what, the Jaworski thing, where you kind of take the old models and apply them where it's 0%, or Treisman. But we actually, I think we probably are looking at different cases that we should sit down and kind of go back and forth, because we found that, so income inequality was the major, most robust, super robust predictor or increase the risk, increase the probability of democratic erosion. Income per capita did not have a direct effect, and when we interacted income inequality and GDP, it was the richer countries were actually more income inequality. The effect of income inequality was amplified in richer countries.
Right.
So that's different, I think, from
It is different.
what you're finding.
Maybe that the type of analysis that we're using is different. This is sort of a complicated interaction in terms of where in the context of a duration model where time dependencies are taken into account.
I'm guessing the dependent variable is also different, right? So you're looking at democratic breakdown.
Exactly.
Right.
Is breakdown, but the next slide,
Yeah.
and then I'll stop with the slides, is we were dissatisfied with the previous graph for reasons that are obvious. And then what we did is the relationship between inequality and the likelihood that there's looser non-consent,
Yeah.
which is like for us, a key variable of erosion or backsliding. And then what we did is, how does development moderate the connection between these looser non-consent and the actual breakdown of democracy? Under what conditions does this looser non-consent translate into an actual collapse of democracy? And then the previous relationship holds is much more likely to happen
That makes
in
sense.
circumstances in which inequality is very high, but the sort of middle-income countries, than it is likely to happen in super duper rich democracies. Now, the US has so many idiosyncratic features,
Yeah.
spatial polarization, particular institutions, other things, that this is no reason to go home and sleep peacefully and just sit it out, right? But the
Right.
general patterns are these ones, and part of what our job is to do is that we are seeing all these symptoms that generate worry, and we go back to sort of Linz has a line in his book that says, it is almost impossible to predict ex ante when these symptoms are going to lead to a full democratic collapse.
Yeah.
And so the question is it is a form of art. Now we have some statistical evidence that shows that there are some expectations that you can have informed on over 100 and some years of data, but those expectations are no guarantee of anything. And the question is where we do look, right?
Should we go into the question of how voters navigate these structural factors and the decisions to support the initiatives of incumbents? This is it's not a curveball for you.
So maybe I could show a slide. So if you
Which one?
maybe the second one. So this is a slide from work with Matt Graham. It's a paper in which we showed people, a lot of pairs of candidates described in various ways, including their party affiliation, various policies. And one of the candidates was at random assigned to also say something undemocratic. So if you read some of this literature, these are often referred to as conjoints, and so these were candidate choice experiments in which the dependent variable was vote for a candidate, and from this we try to reconstruct how do people trade off their commitment to democracy against other political priorities they might have, right? So you're facing a trade-off when the candidate you really like because of his policies or his party also acts undemocratically, whereas the other candidate may be democratic but is much further from you in terms of their policies. And so what this graph shows, so the basic message here is, or what comes out of this is that people do care about democracy, but they often do not care enough to prioritize it over other considerations, like their policy interests. And so this graph shows on the horizontal axis how far the two candidates are from each other. So this is candidate polarization. And so what this means, that the further two candidates are from each other, the greater the price that I'm asking you to pay in terms of foregoing a policy you really like by voting for a candidate or by abandoning a candidate you like more when that candidate acts undemocratically, right? So think about somebody who is a Republican in around 2020 being asked to, or 2024 being asked to vote for Biden or Kamala Harris instead of Donald Trump, right? Like that's a big ask, and here the horizontal axis is basically quantifying that ask. And on the vertical axis is the fraction of our respondents, this is a representative sample of Americans, that is actually willing to abandon their preferred candidate when that candidate is undemocratic. And so what you clearly see that as the price goes up, as you're asking to make a bigger trade-off, a smaller and smaller fraction of individuals is willing to make that trade-off. And so that would be my summary of how I think voters think about it. They, when faced with tough trade-offs, it's not that they don't care about democracy, but a critical fraction often doesn't care enough to put it above other priorities that they have.
Yeah, so I think this question of how do voters understand and think about democracy is super interesting. And one thing that I have been working on recently is just this question of like, do voters know what democracy is? And maybe more importantly, do they think about what democracy or what's anti-democratic in a way that's similar to how we think about it as political scientists? And one thing that I've seen from the existing research is that we usually try to assess these things using kind of closed-end survey questions, right? So we give them the options, and then we say, like, do you think this is democratic or undemocratic? I am super interested in just asking in an open-ended way. Like, if I don't prompt you, what do you think democracy is? So I have some current work where I surveyed 1,300 Americans, and I literally was just like, what do you think democracy is? Like, can you try to define it for me? And the answers were super fascinating because at least from that sample, the results that I got were just very different than how political scientists think about it. So I would say like the kind of most common response I got were outcomes, right? Political scientists tend to think about democracy as institutions, right? You have these democratic institutions, and these are the procedures we use for leaders to be elected. So the most common response that I got were outcomes. So things like, so really common words were things like freedom or equality, right? So the most common type of response that I got were people said, I think that democracy is when you have freedom or when you have equality. The second most common response that I got was people said elections, but they did not condition on free and fair or competitive elections, right? So this is actually a really important qualifier because the vast majority of countries in the world, the vast majority of autocracies now are electoral autocracies, right? So most countries in the world have elections. And so like the most important defining feature between autocracies and democracies is the quality of these elections, right? And so it was actually like a pretty slim minority of people who answered, in the kind of correct political science way of saying, free and fair elections or free and fair elections plus, rights protections and other things like that. So I think, I just think that this is super interesting, and I think we need to think more about how voters think about democracy is, because I think it has implications on whether they find something anti-democratic or not, right? Because if it's true that people, that kind of non-political scientists are thinking more about outcomes, then maybe to them, getting a particular outcome or not is the more important core of democracy, and maybe they don't care as much about procedures, right? Which is like the exact opposite of how we would think about it. And so, yeah, like I think there's just, I think there's like a lot of interesting places to go, maybe with like trying to pair open-ended responses with also then kind of prompting people with closed-end survey responses, maybe, yeah.
I don't know if you want to jump into, so, and what would be then, so if voters care about outcomes, or rather understand democracy in terms of outcomes, what can we say in terms of like the outcomes of democratic systems and the relationship between that and their willingness to forego certain procedures, for the sake of some expected outcomes? I don't know if you want to jump in.
So the research that Milan is describing is really awesome, and it's been super influential, and I think appropriately so. And one of the things that he and Matt Graham did in their research was to do a prior, I'm explaining your research to these folks, a prior survey that asked people, that sort of gave people the kinds of things that you were attributing in the choice experiment, and asking them whether it was democratic or not democratic, and they were pretty good at saying yes or no. And there were very concrete things that were familiar to Americans, like extreme gerrymandering and things like that. I think that, I agree with what Andy's saying. I think that there was a big debate, as you can imagine, in the U.S. after the 2024 elections about, and actually during the campaign, about how much to talk about democracy as opposed to, say, the economy, inflation, that sort of thing. And, from my research, what I found is that even leaders who are trying to kind of soften people up to believe that democracy isn't so important, they're not really criticizing democracy as a system of government. In fact, they claim to be the real Democrats. They criticize particular institutions. So López Obrador spent, vast amounts of time telling Mexicans that judges in the federal system were corrupt and mafiosos and so on. And Hugo Chavez used to talk a lot about the complete hollowness of Venezuelan democracy and so on and so forth. So they attack particular institutions, and the message that they're sending is, we don't really have a democracy. What we need, we have these institutions that are elitist and they're arrayed against you, and what we need to improve our democracy is to tear them down and rebuild them in a way that gives me more control over them. The give me more control over them part, they don't always say it out loud, but that's sort of what it comes down to. I think that what I would add to what's been said is that, democracy, I think people care about things that are close to them. That they sort of can observe and feel in their daily lives. So talking to them about, say, during the first Trump administration, about threats to American democracy was, I think it just felt very, very distant to people. And this goes back to Milan's idea about trade-offs. So when what didn't feel distant was that prices were up, and that was a signal that got to pretty much everyone, and it hurt people, especially people who have lower incomes. In the second Trump administration, the what we might well call violations of democracy, such as suspension of the rule of law, has become more salient, more closer to people. Many people see on the can see on the news, or can see in their feeds, or even in their own neighborhoods, what it looks like when there's when there is not rule of law, and when people can be just picked up arbitrarily or shot at and so forth. And so that it's not, I think Annie's absolutely right that if we come at this with a sort of very model-based idea of what democracy is as a system of government, that's sort of a non-starter, both in terms of trying to get people to stand up for democracy, but also to sort of understand what they're doing, as social scientists understand what they're doing, how they're responding to these kinds of governments. And instead, it has a lot to do with things that feel close to them, that seem to matter to them in terms of the welfare of themselves and their families and their communities.
Okay, so I completely agree with that. It also helps understand some of the pushback that the Trump administration has gotten in specific instances that were very, very, very prominent. But I want to add to sort of Milan's point on the voters, because my worry is with going back to Linz's terminology, I would call sort of a new form of instrumentalism. So in his book, he worries about the instrumentalism by elites. That means the Communist Party goes and runs elections to try to undermine the system from within. The same goes from sort of various versions from extreme right parties. I think what we are talking now here is about a form of instrumentalism by voters, in the sense that, and there is a direct version of it, which is, do I trade allegiance to my preferred candidate vis-a-vis respect for procedures, which is the one you showed us. But there's another one which I think is deeper, and it goes back to inequality, which is, if we think that inequality is a problem, and that providing better public services, reducing inequality, increasing economic opportunity, et cetera, sort of removing the structural conditions for the left behind is the solution, then evidently a lot of the middle classes and upper middle classes are going to have to pay more taxes, and they may have to sacrifice some of their own living conditions. For instance, when it comes to the allocation of schools to different neighborhoods, how those schools are funded through local property taxes, etc., which are all sort of a web of very small micro mechanisms that create a lot of club goods for people of the left. I have done some conjoints on, not in the United States, but in a context which, I mean, you're going to laugh, in Korea, which is, it's a context on which I am clearly an expert on, with some Korean authors, in which this sort of came up very starkly. It's like, we showed, this is the level of inequality in your country. Oh, this is horrible. This is what inequality would look like if we had some institutions like the ones in sort of advanced welfare states in Europe, and this is great. And then we showed, this is how much your taxes would go up if we implemented this reform. Forget it. Okay, so there's a lot of sort of cheap egalitarians out there who are living pretty comfortably. And then they go to demonstrations and they go all these things, etc. But the question is, how do we get this link severed without the help and the consent of this sort of form of instrumentalism? And understanding well what the origins of those new instrumentalists are is pretty essential if we really want to help solve this problem.
So given what time it is, I think it might be a good idea to maybe give a chance to people in the audience to ask questions. Maybe we have time for 2 or 3 questions. So if anyone wants, so we have we have several hands. Well, we'll start,
Will people be able to hear me?
Maybe stand up and
All right. Just very quickly, I'm a bit surprised that nobody has talked about legitimacy in this roundtable. And I wonder, as a political sociologist and also as a citizen, that what we're witnessing in Europe, in many European countries, is probably a change of values, towards democracy, and also a behavior of voters which is changing because of the scoring systems, or just because their interests are also changing, their interests and values, maybe legitimization of our representatives. Could you have some input on that? Thank you.
Do you want us to answer right away, or do you want to collect questions?
maybe we could collect 2 or 3. Okay, so we have Catherine and Mariajo. Catherine.
we always define these outcomes out, but I'm not sure that sits well with me. You can have a hollow out set of institutions that don't do a lot of stuff for
Yeah.
people, and that doesn't feel right with me either. So it's just an observation that we have, and I've not clarified my thinking on it, but I was wondering what you guys think of that.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about the relationship between nationalism and democratic backsliding, and so you know that there's different types of democratic backslide. On the right side, we see that there's a more connection between nationalism, but I wonder how we should think about nationalism in that context. Is it a tool, a rhetorical tool that politicians use to justify democratic backsliding? It is a tool that they use to divert attention for the democratic backsliding that they are doing, or should it be considered part of the democratic backsliding? So the narrowing of the nation, the monopolization of patriotism, is it should we consider it as a component of the backsliding?
Can
Yeah.
jump in.
Oh, God.
So- Go ahead.
Okay, can I actually respond really fast to the governance point? So I think that this is such a good example, actually, of like what part of the problem is, right? So even if you subscribe to broad definitions of democracy, I still don't think it's tied to governance, right? It could be that, you don't just believe in the electoral core, you also believe in different kind of rights protections. But I actually think part of the problem is because rhetorically we say democracy is by the people and for the people, and there's this heavy implication that democracy is where amazing things happen. I actually think that's what triggers a lot of kind of anger, right? Like everyday anger when democracy doesn't deliver, right? Because democracy is it's a system of government. And as you pointed out, some autocracies can actually deliver quite good governance, right? And like, as someone who grew up in the States, like I heard this rhetoric about, democracy and American democracy all the time, right? Like democracies are the most amazing thing ever. America has been like a shining beacon of democracy from the start, which is empirically not true because we did not extend suffrage to the majority of citizens, right, from the very start. And so I actually think that this like heightened language and rhetoric about democracy is like precisely what gets us into trouble with everyday people's expectations about democracy. So I actually think you hit on something really important. So just like as kind of a sideway response to some of the other questions about like values and nationalism, one thing we actually didn't talk about a ton in this panel is democratization and democratic deepening and how that relates to kind of democratic backsliding, right? So, by definition, when we get democratization and when we get, increasing participation, that actually kind of invites more conflict, right? Because previously, underrepresented groups now have more political power and they now have more voice, right? And so that often will kind of incite pushback from other groups that are now getting crowded out or that have kind of declining economic or political influence, right? And so I think we often kind of forget that democracy kind of does invite a lot of conflict, and I think that a lot of these things are happening kind of as a result maybe of kind of democratic deepening, which doesn't diminish the fact that the backsliding is happening, but I think that, I think both of these things, kind of democratization and backsliding, can coexist and probably do feed off of each other.
So, really quick. A colleague, Sebastian Masuka, has a very interesting idea that that a precursor to democratic backsliding, I don't know if this was right, but a precursor to democratic backsliding is a loss of state capacity, which is, in his view, not a governmental outcome. It's sort of something that happens. And then it's misattributed to either democracy or to particular political parties, and then there's a kind of loss of legitimacy and confidence. I think that may well be true. On the other hand, there is also, there's sometimes the loss of state capacity is an intentional outcome of political action. So in the United States, in Great Britain, during the Reagan-Thatcher era, the idea was to shrink the size of the state so you can drown it in a bathtub. That's a quote from a conservative activist. And so, so there's a kind of degradation of state capacity, which then is quite intentional, and then can also pave the way for this kind of loss of legitimacy, loss of confidence. The loss of legitimacy or confidence in institutions is also a byproduct of growing income inequality, and that's something that's been studied nicely, I think, in the U.S. So. Henry Brady and a co-author, and I don't remember the co-author's name off the top of my head, have a very nice study of trends in confidence, Americans' confidence in institutions over the last 50 years, so long time trends, mostly downward, mostly we are less and less confident in institutions, and the interesting thing is it's all kinds of institutions. It's not just it's political institutions, the presidency, the Congress, courts, blah, 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 but it's also banks, sports organizations, it's sort of, schools, higher ed, public schools. There's just a long-term trend toward a loss of confidence, which they link to long-term growth in income inequality that goes back really to the 1980s. And that does contribute to, strategic, what Milan was calling good politicians, and I think he meant good in the skilled sense, not in the moral sense, these, nefarious politicians coming to power and making use of that kind of institutional nihilism to help persuade people that, we really would be better off if the courts were an offshoot of the ruling political party, et cetera. So on your question, the other part I wanted to mention is, that this goes back to Milan's point about, people trade off good things that they want against democracy. My colleague Zhaoshan Luo and Adam Jaworski have a really nice formal paper where they show that it sort of goes to the kind of apocryphal story of the frog in the boiling pot of water who doesn't realize that until it's too late and they're dead. That apparently isn't really true. It doesn't work that way. They jump out of the pot, but anyway, it's a nice story. So the idea is that you trade off. So you get a government that lowers prices or that imposes law and order or does something you like, and they are doing it in an undemocratic way, in a way that maybe you do notice and you do feel it close to home. Think Duterte in the Philippines or Bukele in El Salvador. So they're getting more safety on the streets. They're doing it by killing lots of folks who have nothing to do with drug trafficking or what have you, or throwing them in prison, throwing away the key. So you're willing to make that trade-off, and you don't know where you are on a continuum that's going to end up with you not having the ability to vote these guys out of office. And so you make that trade-off over and over again, and then suddenly you don't like them anymore. Suddenly, my kid just got hauled off to prison, or accused falsely of being a drug trafficker or something, or the economy goes nuts, and all of a sudden you realize, well, we're the dead frog in the water. We can't get rid of these guys. So that process, I think, it puts some limits. That's a theoretical paper, but I think we see some of that in reality, where it places limits on people's willingness to make those trade-offs. But the sad fact is it could be too late by the time they realize that they don't want to make that trade-off any longer.
And on that note, I think unfortunately, we need to conclude now. I wanted to thank all the participants in the roundtable for coming here and for talking and bringing their expertise. Thank you very much.